Good evening. It's a great pleasure to welcome Saskia Sassen to the AA. We have been planning this lecture for quite some time, and I'm really pleased that it's happened now. It's the first time that Saskia is giving a talk here at the AA. Of all the people who have been working on issues of globalization, I think that undoubtedly Saskia has been the one who's done the most provocative, focused, interesting work on the relationship between globalization and urbanization, or cities. In a sense, more recently, and I suppose that the talk that we're going to hear tonight partly deals with the next stage of that research, looking at the relationship of the financial markets, the question of globalization at a smaller scale, or in a sense at a more focused scale, dealing with such issues as the relationship between the digital and the physical, or concepts of context and contextuality in terms of how the things that are invisible might have certain relationships with things that are very visible. Specifically, at times dealing with corporations that are located in very particular situations and sites, and yet are networked and connected through a series of virtual mechanisms of linkage. This, I think, is the main topic of a new book that she has coming out, which is called Global Networks Linked Cities, that will be out in March. More recently, also revised editions of her Cities in a World Economy and the Global City have been published. And of course, she is the author and editor of many, many publications and books, including Globalization and its Discontents. She has, after many years of teaching at Columbia, more recently moved to University of Chicago, where she's the Ralph Lewis Professor of Sociology. She also has a visiting professorship at the LSE, where she is a visiting centennial professor, and is in charge of, or a member of, the Committee for Information Technology and International Relations in the States. Would you please welcome Saskia Sassen?
It's a great pleasure to be here, and I realize, for those of you who know Spanish, I have you all here a media luz. I don't know if you know what that means, but in this darkness. I don't know if this is your usual setting. I am actually going to show, I don't know if anybody has heard me give a talk before. I never, ever in my life have used a slide before, but now that we have what do we call it, PowerPoint, I have visuals. It's actually simply more words, but there you have it. I am text-driven, as we say. The issue that I would like to talk with you about tonight is one that I have been obsessing for a while now. And it is deeply connected to the new network technologies. At the heart of this issue is the fact that given this type of connectivity, and if you, of course, have that type of connectivity, any building becomes part of something that can be a global space. It also means there is another sort of line of thinking that runs through all of this for me, which is more political. I'm not really going to talk about that tonight, but let me just mention it. It also means that any tiny resource-poor organization in any city that has cheap connectivity can become part of global networks that connect other such resource-poor organizations. What interests me is this mix, what is in the title of the talk, micro sites with global span, and what that means. I think it means, something politically, it means something socially, and the question which I have for you, what does it mean for architecture? What does it mean also for urbanism, for urban design, for how we think the space of the city? What does that do to urban space? What does it do to urban spatiality? We can think of an urban spatiality today that actually connects multiple fragments in many, many different cities, and hence create an incredible sort of connectivity, if you want, at the same time fragmenting each of those cities within which it is located. Sometimes when I'm in my most extreme mode, I think that urban space in certain kinds of places, the city of London is just one example, and I mean the city, the financial center, is actually a multiplicity of fragments located on multiple global circuits. What kind of an urban spatiality does that constitute? And if you then extend it to what I was saying before about the political, that multiple small organizations can become connected in this global effort, what does that do also to the civic fabric of a city, the way we used to think of it? Do we need to rethink some of these basic categories through which we have understood the city? For architecture, it raises a whole set of questions that have to do with contextuality and some issues that I will be. Are these microphones all right, or are they talking to each other besides me talking to you? You never know with microphones. So let me start with my visuals that are simply more words for you. The first point, and here I speak very much as a social scientist, but I would think that there is a very particular and specific version that holds for architects and for urbanists of this. And that is that we cannot understand the impact of these new technologies if we simply do what is the most common practice. The lights keep changing. Now we're moving into deep darkness here. If we do what is, I repeat, the most common practice in the United States, which is to make a purely technological reading of the technical capabilities of these technologies. When you make that kind of a reading, number one, you really lose place. And vis-a-vis a whole number of cutting-edge sectors, for instance, in the economy, you lose the significance of the city. Why? Because I'm talking about the new network technologies, right? Computer-based technologies, basically. These technologies allow global dispersal and simultaneous integration. The need of these leading economic sectors for what cities offer, which are spaces of material, physical, human centrality, disappears. If you take this technological reading again to its extreme, you lose all kinds of activities, practices, and forms that are predicated on interactivity, on agglomeration, on intensity, multiplicity, diversities, etc., etc. The critical issue, of course, is that if you're an engineer, it's fine to do a purely technological reading of the technical capabilities of these technologies. Though even, I would say, some engineers need to bring in a few other things. But if you're trying to understand how these technologies intersect with cities, with buildings, with what it means to design a building, for instance, you cannot take this purely technological reading. Now, I would think that you, as urbanists, as architects, as planners, are already caught in such dense physical realities that you are not at high risk of making that kind of a reading. But for social scientists who mostly actually sit at their desks and do everything through their computers, or, you know, I mean, they don't deal necessarily with materialities. This is a very common practice, and it has led to enormously incorrect hypotheses and theses. The end of the city, the end of this, the end of that. It seems to me that one way of thinking about it is what I have here, and that is that we need to understand the specific conditionings that mark the use, the implementation, etc., of these technologies. So one way of putting it is to say that the technical capacities of these technologies loop through, they move through, they're embedded in social, economic, political, cultural systems and agendas. There are multiple purposes. And so the outcomes of that mix of these technical capabilities of the new network technologies and these thick, often dense environments through which they loop are a mixed outcome. It's a mixture, and it will vary depending on what, part of reality you're dealing with. Here I have a little footnote just to create a common shared ground as to what I mean by some of this, and that is the notion. Yes. Let me go back to that. What are some of the features of digital networks, right? I mean, this is now standard knowledge, but I just wanted to make sure that we had that in common. Now, actually, before I go into this, let's look at how this all applies to the issue of cities, the issue of buildings, the issue of architecture. I do want to arrive at the question of architecture. One could say one of the challenges today, if you are an urban designer, a planner, an urbanist, or an architect, is the fact that precisely those people who have, or entities, the firms, whatever, the sectors of society, who have the resources to use some of your kind of knowledge, especially if you're an architect, are the ones that are most capable, because they have the resources, to use these technologies for whatever it is that they're trying to do. For me, the most extreme case, and the one I've focused on a lot in my research, is the issue of finance, global finance. Global finance has the resources, has the will, etc., to use these technologies in whatever ways are most convenient for them, for it. And yet, and here again, I'm not going to develop this too much, and yet we know that global finance in a way oscillates between electronic markets that are global, digitized, and enormously dense concentrations of all kinds of facilities, the city of London, downtown Manhattan, downtown Frankfurt, Paris, etc., etc. These very small, confined geographic areas where it all seems to come together with enormous density. And this, to me, reflects, is an illustration, if you want, of these conditionings. There are evidently in finance, even though it is dematerialized, globalized, can move at the speed of light almost, because it is dematerialized. Even there are evidently conditionings that push it into at least material moments. It's not its whole trajectory, but there are material moments. Now, if you look at the actual building sites, if you look at the parts of the city where finance is concentrated, what you see, what you experience, what your senses give you is a bunch of buildings marked probably in most of these places by enormous density, very often vertical. I'm sure that September 11 is going to change some of that, but still, you know what we're talking about. There is a physicality, there is a materiality that makes it very difficult not to think it as a localized event, as something that is right there, part of your city, part of your neighborhood, etc. And when I've been doing some work with the people in spatial fields, I've been fighting the further development. I don't know if some of you, I'm sure, are very familiar and very involved in that. And these organizations experience the materiality, the physicality, etc. of the city. Now, we also know that those very material buildings are parts of digitalized structures, digitalized spaces, digitalized dynamics. And here is this question of cited materiality and global span. And just to bring up a first crucial issue, here, let me put it as a question. What kind of a relationship does this kind of complex, which is partly very physical, but oriented globally, it definitely has global span, it is a global project, what kind of a relationship does it have to its context? What does the context mean? And if you're a designer, if you're an architect, what is the visual code that this complex of buildings should have? should it signal to the one who is experiencing its materiality, I look like I'm here, but I'm really not completely here? I look like I'm housed in all this concrete and all this stuff, but you know, I'm really, and this is something that I always love asking architects actually, because some of my best friends, architects, and very good people, are contextualists, and they want the context to matter, and they want, you know, a connection between this building and the surroundings. And in a way, that is a simulacrum of contextuality in this case. Do we need to design a visual code that actually makes it possible to communicate to the average passerby, you know what, I really don't care about you, I am really oriented to something else? Or do we bring that down by making it contextual? Again, let me ask, I have my own ideas about it, but I don't want to give you my own ideas. I am not an architect. But I would love to get some responses on that later when we enter into the discussion. You know, how do we, if we deal with the visuals of all of this, how do we handle this new combination of elements, which is, by the way, particularly sharp in the case of financial districts? And here let me just illustrate with a couple of things just to make it clear, though I'm sure, again, many of you know about this already. But a place like the City of London, as you well know, has multiple digital networks that serve it. Most of them are private. And they produce spatialities that connect a bunch of buildings right here with, you know, 25 or 30 other key locations in other cities. So yes, those buildings are here, and yes, those people, that's the global city function party, right? Those people need to interact with each other, but they're also part of a spatiality that has very little to do. They navigate both spatialities. Now you might say, it has always been that way. It's true, it has always been that way. A big question is the intensity with which this fragmenting, this reorienting, this separating, this constructing parts of urban space as bits and pieces on multiple networks. There really is something about little bits. The city of bits, you know, is one sort of image, of course, Bill Mitchell's, but not Bill Mitchell, I think I got that wrong, but you know, I know him. I just can't remember his name. But so anyhow, this is a real issue, I think, in terms of understanding what is the contextuality of this event. I mentioned before at the other extreme the political issues that also play. They play in very different circuits. They play with very different types of agendas and purposes. But they also produce this fragmenting, only they do that more, one could say, in a sort of in a civic way. Now, let me begin to unpack some of this stuff to get at this. And one way of thinking about it is to think of, you know, what are the conditions, what are the reasons, the dynamics that we continue to have these very concentrated financial centers, precisely in those sectors that are the most globalized and the most digitized. And I have written a lot about this, but let me just quickly run through some of this. And I begin to pick up again on what I said before, the limits of technical logics. The fact that technology loops through these dense environments. And let me sort of mention these three elements written up here, which are the key technical property of the new ICTs, global dispersal and simultaneous system integration. Technically, if we took this seriously, this would mean the elimination of agglomeration economies for any economic sector that can use and has the resources to use those technologies. And finance is one of them. And so that is why if you just use this technical logic, it takes you in somewhat of a wrong direction, if you want. Second point, the larger social economic order contains multiple logics. As a result, the outcome, I'm repeating in a way what I said before, is a mix of technical and non-technical features. The relative weight of each will vary depending on the case. And here I would invite you, as you are hearing me talk, to think about the specifics that you are dealing with. It could be, the design of a particular kind of building, especially for a firm that deals with, that is partly digitized in its operations. It could be an urban planning effort in a community where you have a lot of organizations that are connected globally, a lot of environmental activists, human rights. Well, there are many, many different possibilities. And finally, the final point is sort of a key implication of this is that spatial agglomeration may remain as a feature in even the most globalized and digitized sectors, such as finance. In other words, once you take into account these other logics, then you arrive at a condition of mixity, if you want, that makes it possible to understand why physical and spatial agglomeration continues to be a feature. And there, so we wind up with, just look at the first line with, I'm just reviewing this very, very quickly here, global cities, these concentrations of specialized functions and resources for the management, coordination, and servicing of the global operations of firms and markets. Now, second very important dynamic that now I unpack that statement that I just gave you briefly is the notion that the global economy needs to be managed, serviced, designed, implemented, etc. Out of that comes, I think, the global city function. It is not about headquarters. I mention this not because I want to talk necessarily about global cities, but because I want to then wind up with the more specific micro spaces, and especially if I think sort of the architecture and the urban design issues for what are major financial and business centers. This is, I think, a crucial issue, because it means that you're dealing with a firm, you're dealing with a space that is actually concentrating crucial and strategic activities for this global economic system. It is not that this space that is right here is just this space and then there is all the rest. And one of the questions for me would be, if I were an architect, is what does this mean at the level of designing an office or an office space? I mean, there were always a sector of the activities that took place in an office that had nothing to do with that actual office space. They took some place somewhere else, right? The famous thing of the golf course, the power lunch, etc., etc. But now we're dealing with a different kind of combination, which is that a whole series of actions of a given firm, for instance, are taking place in a digital space that is, implanted in multiple locations overseas. What does it mean to think the space of the office? What does it mean to think the activity of a firm when you are thinking of designing it? Similarly, I would say, I mean, these are very different versions, when you are designing a neighborhood, when you want a kind of urban planning that really brings this neighborhood together. If it is a certain kind of neighborhood, and that's the kind of neighborhood I want to focus on, a neighborhood where you have all of these organizations that are, digitally connected with other such organizations worldwide, et cetera, what does it mean to plan such a neighborhood? And I think that part of the challenge today is about beginning to negotiate these two very, very different levels. I repeat, any neighborhood in a big city and any, leading economic sector in a big city has long operated on multiple scales, the local scale and some sort of global scale. The question is that today, connectivity has increased. It has assumed so many different forms. It has captured so much more of what these firms do, of what these organizations do, like my activist organizations, etc. So I think there is a qualitative transformation. We have crossed a threshold, and thinking what it means to plan such a neighborhood, thinking what it means to design these types of firms, simply involves a negotiating of, again, sort of the image that I like to use, these sighted materialities that are micro materialities, and these possibilities of global span. I have a few more detailed things on here, but I don't think that this is the occasion to develop it. Now let me move a bit more to this kind of stuff. And to me, a fascinating sort of dynamic, the fact that there is a map, there's an urban map that is getting produced, which is, I mean, one way of describing it is an urban spatiality that is made up both of very dense nodes in multiple cities and the transactions that connect these cities, which is like a cross-border, cyberspace, just to use shorthand. Now the technologies, coming back to my initial statement, these technologies, supposedly, these network technologies, should not map this way at all. There should be an enormous amount of friction in a way. These two maps should be very different. But in fact, they're not. And to me, this has partly to do with the fact that we're not just dealing with these technologies as purely technological events. They are continuously derailed from the technological project that they represent by the realities which they in a way have to negotiate. So that we have wound up today, and again, I'm sure many of you have seen these maps, we have wound up with the geography for the infrastructure of these technologies that is characterized by, yes, global span and very intense nodes. I added a third element, but I don't know that I want to get too much into that. It's sort of a bit complicated. Is this notion of the value added of organizational complexity for users of these technologies. What is now becoming clear is that if you are looping your technological, resources through enormous organizational complexity, you are extracting much more in terms of the benefits that you can derive for whatever your project, financial, political, etc., from those technologies than when you lack organizational complexity. Now, these are finer points. I don't know how interested you are in this, but I mean, in some of the issues that some of you at least are dealing with, I think this is actually an important matter. The example that I like to give in order to sort of illustrate it is in the United States, we have an institution called the Public Library. You have something like that here too. And it is really quite astounding how you'll find in most small towns a little public library. And it's literally a little public library, though it's built as if it were a Greek temple. They seem to have something about that. But these little public libraries built like Greek temples are nowadays all connected to the World Wide Web. This is a miracle, right? They access millions of books in the whole world in a little town that is truly a town where you really don't want to live, probably. What those little libraries are using in this miraculous experience of connecting to the World Wide Web is like 0.001% of the technical capability that fiber optic cable, which is likely to be the way in which they get the connectivity, can produce. Put that same fiber optic cable, same bandwidth carrying capacity, same speeds, etc., downtown here in the financial district, and that firm, that market, using that fiber optic cable is getting not just 100% out of that cable, it is pushing that cable to deliver more and thereby pushing, and there is a whole power project that I don't want to lose here, I'll make it as a footnote, but that is in fact pushing the development of that technology more and more in the direction of its project. Whereas the little public library is using just a little bit of that cable and is not pushing either the development of the technology. Now you can make a parallel argument. I've done a lot of stuff on this on software. Because the software you can think of as that which mobilizes the hardware, right? So I use software as an indicator to understand whose project is getting constituted in this whole new sort of, digital era. And there has been an enormous shift over the last 15 years, mind you. And so I use software as an indicator. It's a certain kind of software that is getting privileged, that is getting the funding for research, et cetera, et cetera. And that is why one of my sites is sort of as a digital activist, you know, that the more people use that space, use this form of connectivity, use these technologies, the more their projects can also begin to shape the software. I mean, I don't know if any of you is actually interested in this kind of stuff, but this is history in the making, all of this stuff. And these new technologies are shaped. What I'm saying is they're present, they're partial events, conditioned by the settings. But they have altered also this building. This building has a different meaning, any setting where you have a lot of connectivity. Now, I realize that you mostly probably use the technology as a studio stuff, right? But, you know, anyhow, enough on that. So, just to wind up with this part here, that the logics here behind this A and B, again, the point that I want to get at is the irony that these technologies that are about space-time compression and about neutralizing distance have had as an effect the valorizing, the adding meaning to a set of global cities which become centers of enormous power, and there are about 40 in the world, but on a more micro scale have added to the power of these concentrations like financial centers. The counter geography of globalization is that political activism that I also mentioned in passing. This is, I'm not going to talk about this, but this is more the whole question of the politics that can also get enacted in these cities. And I think that that is probably an issue that is of much greater concern to planners and urbanists than to architects. But as an urbanist, what I would say, though I'm not a real urbanist, you know, but I'm sort of an urbanist, but as an urbanist, what I would say is that this political side, that to me is very important. The lecture that I'm doing at the LSE on early February is more about this political side for those of you who are interested. But the political side of the meaning of these technologies for the space of the city is that it is making that urban space, which is always productive space, right? It's an enabling space. It is enabling certain forms of the political, which it's not that they're new in the sense of new. That's always a very difficult thing to say, this is new. But they have novel features. And for me, one of the issues is that through the connectivity, let's just say, of political organizations, resource poor but political, connected, etc. What you are creating is a map also, a partly digitalized map, if you want, that connects different types of organizations in different cities, and in a way is a political geography that bypasses the state system. And this is the case with a lot of the activists around questions of anti-globalization, questions of environment, human rights, you know, a whole variety of issues. And very interestingly, makes possible sort of a political activism and a politics on the part of actors who are often informal actors. I mean, they're not, you know, they're not politicians, they're not diplomats, they're not representatives, they're not part of the corporate elite, they're not part of the media elite. They can be very obscure organizations, very poor organizations, very poor individuals, very invisible individuals. But they emerge in this new, also global geography that these technologies make possible as actors and enactors of a certain kind of politics. And the anti-globalization network is, of course, a very good example of that. And when I say informal subjects, I was also thinking about the fact, for instance, that take the anti-globalization activities, since it's a familiar case. These are people who, no matter what their nationality, well, not no matter what their nationality, but let's say many of them, go and do this activism in a city, in a country where they are not citizens, but think that activity as somehow a kind of citizenship practice, but they're in a way informal citizenship practices because they are not citizens of that country. So there is a way, again, in which in this micro level, this micro scale, these possibilities of connectivity bring with them, they don't cause them, but they enable them and they bring with them new configurations that also enter these kinds of political issues. Now let me begin to sort of wind up asking or focusing on these three kinds of issues that bring it down to questions of architecture and a certain kind of urbanism, you know, a sort of small scale, if you want, urbanism. The first, and I'm recapping some of the points that I've been talking about. By the way, can you people there see or not? You can, okay, great. The first is this question of negotiating a spatiality that contains both material physical nodes and on the other hand these digital networks. I'll just run through the three and then we can unpack each one of them a bit. Secondly, the meaning of the context for the physical node when it has global span and operates continuously in both that physical space and that global digital space, if you want. And third, and this is the one that in a way I'm most intrigued by, and the one that I always have questions for my audiences when I talk about this, and I rarely get answers. So I want to see whether, you know, what kinds of answers we can come up with here. The third one is this, the point of intersection between physical space and digital space. Is that a line that separates two distinct realities, or is it actually a far more complex zone where we used to dualizing categories? It's either digital or it's not digital. It's either physical or it's not physical. Are missing something crucial, and that is that that zone produces enormous intersections, and these intersections in turn constitute its own peculiar hybrid, if you want, spatiality. You can see by the enthusiasm with which I attack this third point that this is where my head is really on. But anyhow, let's move to that first one. Now, here I think there are multiple issues in this negotiating. And again, I've touched upon some of them as I was talking about the broader context. But one of them is this question of design. You know, how do you design an office for a global financial services firm? Where in fact there are practices. This is not that, okay, now we're working here, and then when we are working, you know, vis-a-vis the global market, we're in some other space. No, I'm right here at my desk, if they still have desks or whatever, and I'm in both spaces at the same time. If I unpack the activities of this firm, I actually am dealing with something that is continuously negotiating these two spatialities. Is the meaning of the office space, of the conference room, etc., for these kind, and let's just think about the young, you know, barracudas that work on Wall Street or in the City of London, who are totally at home in both mediums, right? What is the experience of office that means? I mean, can we still use these beautiful texts that we have about offices, you know, the power technologies of office space, etc.? Is that still capturing what is happening, or is something else happening? I was very struck, this was a few years ago, I was in New York, and the United States had just deregulated telecommunications. As a consequence, the big head of the New York Telecom, which had moved, because highly regulated industry, what you need to worry about, had moved to the suburbs. After deregulation, which meant that the telecom now could think itself regional, global, you know, they could do what they wanted, basically. The top CEO, the top executive, and his top staff moved back to Manhattan. And so we were at this talk, and this was a very New York crowd. So a non-New York crowd, the first question they would have asked, my God, why move back to Manhattan? You know, but not this crowd. This was a Manhattan crowd, so they didn't ask that question. What they asked is, why did you move into such a modest office? You are the New York Telecom. And the answer was, I did not move back to Manhattan to be in my office. I moved back to Manhattan to be in an information loop. So this is sort of one micro instance where this notion of the representational office, all of that, it is a different meaning. The office space is a space traversed by multiple circuits of all kinds of activities. And I mean, there might be, I understand that you have just done a whole year or something on offices and or whatever, and you have a book coming out. I would be very curious to look at that, because I am not sure that the vocabularies, the images, the categories that were developed in the past, I mean, I'm not totally up to date with the office literature, I confess, okay, that is not necessarily my specialty, but I've read some of the older literature and also Foucauldian analyses of the office. I don't mean Foucault himself, I mean young architects doing a Foucauldian analysis, and I love that kind of stuff. I think that reads very well, it's very compelling, very persuasive. I'm just not sure that in these kinds of spaces that I'm talking about and that I deal with, that captures what's going on. And again, I now will just simply allude to that other example, the neighborhood full of, you know, not full, but where you have multiple sort of activisms that are also engaging in connectivity. You understand that right now we have all kinds of very resource-poor organizations in many different cities around the world that are connecting to each other, that are communicating with each other. This is transforming also the meaning of what one might experience if you walk through it as a poor neighborhood. It begins to produce a different kind of meaning for what the neighborhood is. Let me move to this second point. Again, here, for me, the issue is how do we understand the context? When for a building, let's again look at the financial center, because it's such a brutal event in a way. If this cluster of buildings is incidentally located in its surrounding setting, if it's all about its internal connectivity, its internal networked characteristic, why should there be an issue about making it look a bit like it connects to the surrounding? Now, I don't know, I'm not so familiar about London, but in New York, this was like a big issue for a lot of the very good architects and good urban planners, the people who really cared about the city and cared about people and cared about making it all better. The push towards, you know, making it somehow be part of that broader context. And to me it seems that perhaps it might be preferable to make, I don't mean a brutalist architecture in the sense of the brutalist style, but I mean a brutal statement that signals I'm a fragment and you are a partial event, etc., etc. Now again, it's a question of thresholds. These are conditions that have always existed. But to what extent are we today dealing with a more brutal version of that disconnecting, of that reorienting? And something I did not talk about here, but a crucial condition in a lot of this stuff is the internal connectivity of the sector. And here, for me, a very wonderful example, I've mentioned it in one of my books also, some of you may have come across it, when they were rebuilding the financial center in Toronto. By the way, one does not get often an opportunity to get at these bits of truth, if you want, because, you know, we're dealing with inertia of built environments, we're dealing with limited possibilities of radical designs of a whole complex that would make legible what are its conditionings. But in this case, we have an example like that, what we in the social sciences call a natural experiment situation, where you somehow, issues become legible, which otherwise are not legible. And this was downtown Toronto, rebuilding of the financial center. They did a survey. They wanted to know, do we put a lot of the stuff outside? Do we put it at what distance? And the answer they get time after time from the financial services firms, the professionals, was, just remember that 15 minutes is a long walk. Now, this is interesting in two senses. Number one, why even bother to bring in walk? Why walk? I mean, they're totally wired up. Why do they have to walk, right? And the second one is, of course, this notion, 15 minutes is a long walk. 15 minutes is not a very long walk, but, you know, it's a long walk. One element that I want to take, there are many things that this makes legible, but let me just pull out one little element which is central to my argument here. And that is the extent to which this is a sector that is internally oriented. This is enormous connectivity, enormous transactivity, that it's internal. That is another way of saying that a threshold has been crossed in terms of the extent to which it is internally oriented. Then if you take into account that it is located on multiple private digital networks that connect it globally. I mean, the most famous case of this is one, and I, you know, this is sort of to me the clearest example, and one many of you probably have heard about, is the famous MCI WorldCom, an IBNOD network that connects, what does it connect? It connects about 27 major financial business centers in Europe with about another 20 or something like that in the United States. You know, this is a totally private networked space that functions partly as a unitary space. Only it's partly deterritorialized and it has global span. There are multiple such networks. In the case of the City of London, there are at least 6, but in fact now I think it's up to 8. So when you put all of that together, then this question of the context assumes a meaning that goes beyond, of course, the visuals of it. But as architects, as urban designers, you've got to also deal with the visual code that is getting produced. And to me, this is sort of, if you want, a pregnant subject. Now, third point, the intersection of space and digital space. And here, let me just give you some of my experiences in talking about this and some of my thinking about it. The most common answer to this question of, you know, where is this intersection? What is this intersection? And I'm dying just to ask you, what do you think is the typical answer? What do you think it is? Would anybody dare to speak up right now and say what they think? How would you name the line that separates? Nobody? Nobody daring to be imprudent? No? What? Well, the typical answer is, of course, the screen, right? The space of the screen. The space of the screen is the interface, right, where you're connecting those two. Well, to me, that seems incredibly problematic as an answer. There is a very partial truth to that. If you accept that notion of the screen, you are saying, actually, that these are two separate zones, and the screen is that dividing line that is not an in-between zone. It clearly is the one, it's an interface, if you want. Now, I must say that it's an enormously sophisticated writing about the screen, the space of the screen, and I don't know if any of you deals with this or, you know, works on this, but there is very interesting work. The screen is not an uninteresting point in all of it. It is an interesting one. But I think it's insufficient. And let me just, again, I go at this more as a social scientist. And number one, I just want to mention a few things. Something we might call mediating cultures. And here the research that I'm doing tries to understand, all right, so you have access to the machine, you have access to the technology, right? Let's just think an individual. So that's not an issue. It's not a question of the digital divide and all of that. How you use that technology, and neither is it a question of how much you know about the technology, but how you construct that which we call using the technology, which we may just assume is a non-entity. It's a given. Okay, you, the machine, you are using it. Use is technically conditioned, etc. Yes, it is technically conditioned, but only so much. And in fact, you can begin to see, now that there is such a diversity of users all around the world, different subcultures, different communities, you begin to see that there is a whole diversity of mediating cultures through which the use gets constituted. It is simply naive to think that it's just a question of knowing how to key in the instructions and how to use this or that software to do what you want to do. There is a lot of stuff, and this comes back to my first, to that earlier point I made, that there is a whole politics that attaches to questions of software design. What is the software design that is getting produced now? Where are our resources? All our governments put a lot of money into research on this. Where is it going for? Well, it's going for certain kinds. How to protect private property, how to do encrypted stuff, etc., etc. So there is a whole politics, if you want, that attaches, or politics of power, if you want. But the same thing with the use question. It is charged. It is, So anyhow, and in this last research that I did, I looked also at questions of women and gendering. Are there subcultures within which use gets constructed in very different ways from what it does, in other kinds of cultures? Here again, coming back to connectivity as a part of a financial district versus connectivity as part of a set of organizations that are organizing globally against globalization. This question of the mediating cultures. So for me, one of the critical issues is that intersection of the physicality within which part of the process happens, and then the digitality within which the rest of the process happens, is actually a border zone. And that signifies to me also that there are many, many different ways that can go, and that in terms of the historic moment where we are at right now, we have only experienced a few of these. There's much more to come. There is room for enormous innovation. And here again, for those of you who are a bit into this stuff, the whole resurgence of open source is very interesting, because open source constructs networks. Open source is not just a free net. Open source is a complex collective endeavor, even though it is of course now owned by IBM. But no matter, as a practice, IBM has been very smart. It has allowed a zone where open source can again be sort of one way of handling software development. Now, another for me issue in this border zone are work cultures and how you actually organize the work practices in a setting. Now, this I would think intersects also with architecture, in the sense of the meanings that inscribe the building through the design. In other words, that is why I make that distinction between architecture versus building. It's not just about housing the people and the machines. That is one form that we also see a lot of. But what I'm thinking about is precisely architecture, insofar as design practice is inflected by all kinds of things. Now, they could be very familiar issues, like different design cultures in different countries, different histories, but they can also be much more elusive, complex, sophisticated, and not so much predicated on these growth forms of differentiation, different country, different culture, but much more complex, if you want, issues. And here, if we begin to think, especially I repeat, in certain kinds of spaces which are charged with the whole question of the connectivity, if we begin to think about that intersection, and again now, thinking in terms of design issues, a design that is inscribing that space with certain kinds of meanings, and we think about this intersection as a complex zone where things are getting constituted, cultures are actually subcultures, specialized subcultures are getting constituted. That, I would think, would change the activity of designing, of understanding what that means when you're dealing with a space that is, again, I repeat, charged with this connectivity question. the spaces can be, the financial services firms, or it can be a very different kind of space. It can be Amnesty International, which is deeply dependent and user of global media. Global media has made all the difference for the human rights struggle. So, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I see that I have talked for an hour, which was not my intention. So I'm going to stop here, and I hope that we can pick up on some of these issues in the discussion. I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
I mean, I think Saskia has very provocatively asked people to respond. I was hoping also that she would give her own sociological point of view in relation specifically, well, maybe not to the physical space, but at least to the digital. But maybe this will come up in the discussion. So could we get a mic over here?
And tell me also who you are. I mean, are you an architect, are you a planner, etc.? That sort of helps me.
What gives you the right to ask that question? Yeah, just like
from where are you coming?
I used to be an architect. I think. Well, I'm a theorist. My name's Neil Leach. I think, well, since you asked the question, what is the intersection of physical space and digital space? I think the question's probably wrong in the sense that I don't think that one can think about these things operating on the same register as though they are kind of like things bumping into one another. I think that maybe if one perceives a kind of model in which they're operating at a kind of different registers, and almost in a way, say, within a psychoanalytic model, there is a kind of symbolic and the imaginary sort of level in which things can be kind of totally contradictory. And obviously there are certain points at which the two hook up together, and one thinks perhaps of the example that Bill Mitchell gives of sort of tunnel effects, for example, where digitalized connections between, say, Soho and Hollywood, the bandwidth that allows those things to be hooked up in a certain sort of way, but on the whole, they kind of almost float free of one another and operate in a different register, like almost like one at the ideational and one on the physical sort of level. And occasionally I think there is maybe a play between those two. One could possibly think about maybe a kind of meteorological map where there's a physical kind of terrain, and then a kind of a layer of pressures and weather fronts and things that are operating above it, maybe attracted in some way to some physicality, but actually moving separately. So I thought that maybe that if you're going to think about that, you shouldn't really think about it in terms of a kind of line, so much as a more sort of fluid and dynamic negotiation. And possibly there's a model. I like talking about the notion of camouflage. And if there is a kind of model that I'd sort of throw out as a way of kind of thinking about that play, it would be precisely that one of camouflage, particularly thinking about the notion of context. The interesting about camouflage is not that you kind of become like everything around you. You actually pretend you are in order to be different. And if one could see that kind of that operation operating at an urban level, like an urban level of camouflage, then a kind of more complex operation is there, which doesn't think about things in terms of lines or border zones, but a more kind of fluid and dynamic sort of possible space negotiation.
Well, that's very interesting. See, for me, a line is a radically different construction from a border zone. A border zone is truly a terrain that is constituted via practices. It's an ambiguous zone, and hence the practitioners, so to speak, are, or the practicers, I'm not talking about practitioners, but the ones engaging in the practices will shape that zone. So your notion of camouflage is not far from what I was thinking of when I said mediating culture, which is that it's just naive to think that it is a transparent interaction. There is an enormous amount of stuff happening, and it is, in fact, an enormous research agenda, because it's going to be very, very different in many, many settings. And most people aren't even alerted, to these kinds of issues that you are talking about. But the notion of camouflage is actually an interesting one. Now, it's camouflage from a certain positionality. The issue of positionality hovers over such a notion as camouflage, because it's already vis-a-vis something that is camouflage. So positionality must be named here, because it's not a neutral position to call it camouflage. But you said something else, when you said the pressures, like you said wind currents or something like that. Right. Now, I, again, in my effort to discipline some of this, like my using mediating culture today rather than camouflage, because I don't want the positionality issue left floating, unnamed but present. But secondly, the pressures, to me, those are conditionings, So I agree with what you're saying. Though I don't fully agree with Bill Mitchell. I think he has too much of a technologically driven kind of set of interpretations there. And the tunnels, what you mentioned between Hollywood and Soho and all of that, that is interesting. That is, of course, part of the connectivity question. It does not necessarily get at this, what I'm still calling intersection, though you're suggesting that intersection is not such a good term to use here. But I'm going to remember these things. I like camouflage. I like it. So yes, very good.
I was hoping that you wouldn't agree with him because
Well,
one of the problems with camouflage is that it still is hooked up with the idea of the visuality and the visibility of the thing. So it's trying to, if you follow the argument about it looking like one thing and appearing to be something else, it's still a kind of contextualist.
Visual.
Well, it's a contextualist argument in the sense that, go on.
No, it's not. I wouldn't say that at all. It's really an ideational question. You're thinking yourself into a position. I think that's really what I find interesting about the world of the digital. It's really an ideational zone. It's kind of like a hypertext to kind of the world, like a gloss, almost like advertising is the physical world. And I'm thinking about, you might, in presenting yourself a certain sort of way, you actually are maybe thinking yourself different.
Right.
I think
But camouflage, with camouflage, the one thing that I did say is that camouflage is a positionality. And so it is, in that sense, to me, you either have to, I want that positionality named then. And that is why camouflage is just naive to think that it can just simply be camouflage. It's camouflage. But that does then enter into this question of the visuality of it. It's a visuality that gets produced. So I heard what you said. It's ideational rather than, but there is also that visuality dimension, though it's maybe more at the level of the concept than at the level of the thing that you are trying to describe when you say camouflage.
Well, I think psychoanalysis would be a way to think about those things.
Right.
Self-representation.
I have a resistance with psychoanalysis. I'll say I grew up in Latin America and in Buenos Aires where everybody was a Lacanian. It cured me forever. And my husband always says that I may have a spiritual life, but I don't have a psychological life. So when you say psychological, I don't know what to do. I'm a bit at a loss. Ideational, I do understand. All right. Yes. Oh, are you handling the... This is a Chinese style.
Thanks very much. Norman Bales, I'm an architect, but I also do work in philosophy whenever I can. One of your propositions went something like, globalization destabilizes existing hierarchies of formalized power.
Right. That's a whole other lecture.
Yeah, and
Yes.
I'm really troubled by that proposition because I would have thought it's precisely the reverse. That globalization consolidates hierarchies of formal
I see what
power.
you're saying. Okay, fine.
But are you going to say that the destabilization arises out of global NGOs, the ecological movement, Greenpeace and so on? Because if you are, I'll come back straight away and I'll say I regard those as purely marginal influences.
Yeah.
I think
No, actually, I mean
consolidation.
something else. I mean something a bit different. And it is that when I say existing formalized hierarchies of power, I am talking about a system where the national state and the interstate system is, as I said, it's another lecture, is in charge of running the cross-border dynamics. Globalization destabilizes it because it reduces partly the role of the national state through privatization, deregulation, etc. It makes ascendant certain supranational organizations like WTO. It makes also ascendant subnational entities like global cities, and in that sense destabilizes existing formalized hierarchies of power. And my argument goes then further, and I say that out of that destabilizing, operational and rhetorical openings are produced for new types of subjects, subject as actors, to emerge. And that then loops back with what I was briefly touching on, these informal political subjects. You can be an undocumented immigrant and do a certain kind of politics. You're not a citizen, in other words, in a city like London, etc. Right? I mean, so it's sort of a whole political architecture, if you want, that gets produced that has these open zones, these unattended spaces, where new kinds of politics, new kinds of political subjects getting. So that was a bit my thing. And then the destabilizing of scales is what I just said. That it used to be that the scaling question, but this again, this is now we're talking social science, okay? God forbid.
Can I just come back very quickly?
Absolutely.
My problem with the response to that is that your characterization of power has to do with the political. I mean, obviously, it's true to say that with the forces of globalization, there's a reconfiguration going on of the international state-nation system.
Yeah.
Of course, that's right.
Yeah.
The EC and so on.
Right, right.
But there are people, and I'll be one of them, who would argue that this reconfiguration is simply consolidating much more powerful forces than just the political.
Yeah.
And it is not leading to a destabilization.
Yeah. No. Look, in the end of the story, I agree with you. But guess what? I'm a theorist, right? So I spent years physically sitting, researching, thinking, figuring out, etc. So, yes, you're absolutely right, you know, and I spent 10 years doing this big project that I'm doing on denationalization. But so I have just a few added wrinkles to it, also because of the suffering on my face, but I mean to the subject. And that is that, yes, I agree with you. But the trajectory to get there is a charged one, and it warrants, I would say, it demands detailed, empirical, etc., specific. So one of the issues that happens, for instance, is that for me, this is now my current sort of work, okay? This is my language also, that what is happening is that parts of the national, ministries of finance, central banks, the regulatory agencies that we experience as national are actually not national in the way that they had historically been constructed. They are now denationalized. They're oriented towards creating that global capital market, etc., etc. So in that sense, I resist saying that the national is simply, it's more of the same. No, I think there are fundamental transformations, and that then the national state is simply, it's still there and it's going to remain there for a long time, and it's very important. It fulfills many functions for global capital. But it is a changed condition in itself, and so my concern is with getting at that. But you know what, this is really another lecture. But I think we actually agree. It's just that I have my own complex conceptual architecture to capture some of this stuff. Aha, but this has silenced... yes.
Can we pass the mic back just behind you?
Thank you. Neil Barton, I'm from the Bath. Before that, I worked for many years in the capital markets for a New York firm, ostensibly based in London, but in reality based somewhere west or east of Heathrow. In some of your previous works, you're one of the few people to have recognized that the way the capital markets have developed, in reality, they are large-scale production centers. In a sense, no different from a factory in the Midwest or in northern England, where you have more than 50% of the people in the building who never see daylight from the time they enter to the time they leave and never travel anywhere. They're just workers. And in that sense, thinking about your Spitalfields work, they belong to the local community. They're just part of it. There are maybe 10% of the employees who sit on a plane going to places they didn't really want to go to, at times when they didn't really want to go. And they don't really, and I was one of those, and they stop belonging to anywhere. They're not quite British, or they're not quite American, or they're not quite European.
Nylons. the New York-London crowd, you know, the ones that commute once a week, that are now called the nylons.
Thank
You hadn't heard that? Well, that's been around for about a year now. I feel like one of them, but yeah. Yes, no, I see what you're getting at. I appreciate
If you
that.
take the company I work for, it had 400 offices in the US, in most cities. And if you go in any one of those offices, it doesn't matter whether it's in Alabama or in LA or in New York, the office looks exactly the same. When you walk through the door, you could be in any city. You wouldn't know what city you're in. That is tempered a little bit overseas because you've got then interacting cultures to cope with and local managements who have slightly different views, sometimes radically different views. So I would contend that probably there is a mixture of a relationship to the local tempered by some anonymous person in a building in New Jersey or somewhere.
Right. You really, there are two components. I want to get this thing off. Two components to your point. I would say. One of them is what you mentioned about spittle fields, and you're right. In my own work, I have actually documented how in Manhattan, about 50% of the people who work on Wall Street have nothing to do with finance. They're part of the financial industry, but they're not. And they are part of the community. And so one of my issues is that when I look at, I'm not advertising, all right? I suddenly see that the little miracle happened there. And in fact, I have insisted, this is when I work with immigrants, etc., that one of the images that we should have about Wall Street is that it is also the workplace of these immigrants. And so in that case, you know, you can see the parallel to your comment. And when I was speaking here now, I did not go into that particular, because I just wanted to stick with, you know, but to me this is a crucial issue. And that is part also of how to handle that question of the context. But to me, the political project there is that one then begins to valorize as a culture, as a business culture, as an urban culture, these other workers. On the one hand, you know that a lot of your revenue is coming from finance here in London, in New York, etc. Then also realize that 50% of the people who are working in this industry have nothing to do with your image of the super professional. Valorize them, recognize them, give them better wages, etc. You know, so it gets caught up in another sort of bundle of issues. But I do think that is important. And in the Spitalfield stuff, that to me seems crucial to recognize, is that when we think about employment in the city, though many of these people may not be working in the city per se, by the way, they may be working 2 hours away, you know, that it's a very mixed environment, actually. Now, the other point about the spaces, you know, that you say the spaces are all the same. Yeah, I mean, the hyperspace of business, as it's often referred to, whether it's fancy brand name architecture or whether it is just your average builder who just puts, you know, a cube together. This is an issue. Now, when I wanted to emphasize that there is a project for architects in understanding this kind of spatiality, rather than builders. Builders, forget it. You know, all you have to house are some people who traverse it and some machines. But if architecture has a specific intellectual project as an inevitable part of its practice, and if the work of the architect means also to inflect, to inscribe the materiality of the space with something through design, through color, through light, whatever it might be, it seems to me that there is an interesting intellectual project of understanding how these kinds of spaces that are so traversed, that exist as fragments, you know, what is it? What is it that one would be trying to capture? I mean, I do think that high modernism sought to capture something that was there, either in a form of contestation or in a form of actual rendering. And it seems to me that right now this is part of the story. And at the same time, I feel that also for planning at a neighborhood level, or in a more complex issue, I don't know, I wouldn't even begin how to wrap my brain around it, the level of city, you know, how do we think a city like London today, where there are so many projects going on. I mean, you are rebuilding in bits and pieces big parts of the city, you know, and it's like there is a discourse that I sense is lacking, you know, in terms of some of these very current issues, like these technologies, which are producing a topography that will be with us for a very long time, you know. It's very partial, it's at risk of invisibility very often, but it is a shaping event, these new technologies for me. Again, I repeat, this is all very partial, and it's not the, you know, it's a micro instantiation of something, but it's there. So in that sense, coming back to your 400 spaces all the same, I mean, if you're a builder or if you're a firm who's doing it on the cheap, sure. But if you are in studio here, or you are an architect who's actually working, it's sort of an interesting intellectual project. Now, clearly it is, you know, it's an intellectual project. It's a luxury of elites, you know, to be sitting. But to me, of course, it is a way, everything that has to do with a city, with buildings, is a way of making legible certain issues that do not necessarily, that are not completely legible. You know, it signifies something.
Maybe, I mean, one of the things that, for me, gets a little bit of a short shrift is the concept of technology, in a way. I mean, you at the beginning, you were referring to the fact that with the engineers and the notion of a lot of focus on technology. So somehow, the impetus of this discussion gets focused on certain aspects of representation. How do you make manifest something of new forms of relationships? And I wonder whether there is not the possibility of also thinking about technology in a slightly different way, given the fact that we are also operating within a context where there is a certain level of unexpected possibilities of that technology as well. So when you were discussing things like in the City of London, the pushing of the actual cable in some way, the moment when the exaggeration of a certain condition also has certain byproduct. So the relationship between technology, for example, and spatiality is one that is not only focused on architects, in a way, finding the right way of handling that technology, but also because the technology itself produces certain spatialities, which it has done, for example, in terms of the office building around the turn of the century, or in terms of the impact of the telephone and whatever, in terms of how the office was organized. So now it seems that this idea, this is why I was partly also questioning the issue of camouflage, in the sense that it locates the work of the architect again in terms of the representational, and that the non-representational dimension of this discussion is the moment at which technology also produces a kind of invisible or non-representational spatiality. So you have to really find out how things would work in the context of the office. And that's what became the representation of the office. The same way that cladding, in terms of the skin or whatever, was the result of certain products, certain situations to do with industry. It wasn't that the architect thought of, well, it would be really great, instead of having a kind of masonry building, that we will now have a glass building, because it was cheaper. You got more space out of that. So I would have thought that there are more possibilities which we simply, as architects, are not necessarily in control of, but we have to be open also to the possibilities of that technology, or the possibilities of that relationship in terms of its sort of potential spatialities. And I think that work is there are a lot of people who are interested in that, and it's going on. And in some ways, that sort of work would be a little bit more even critical of things like the way the word context is used, because in architecture it means
all kinds of things.
All kinds of things, but ultimately, very quickly, a kind of representational dimension.
Yes,
here you are.
exactly.
Are you sympathetic or not sympathetic?
Right.
But
No,
I think that becomes quite interesting.
This is very interesting what you're saying, and I realize that partly because I'm not an architect, I expect something from architectural practice. I see it as a very specialized form of knowledge, and that help. It is or it isn't?
It isn't.
Well,
Very basic.
It can be basic. No, but it is a specialized form of knowledge. It is. It is. And I expect it to make legible certain things rather than is that representing? Is making legible representing? For me, no. But I speak as a social scientist. For me, when it makes it legible, it is not constructing a representation, but it may have to construct a representation to make something legible. You see, but I would like to distinguish those two. But you know what you're saying. I mean, this is to me very, very actually very important, and it's true that one falls very easily in this question of the representational. And I was also, I mean, this is a lecture. I don't know exactly to whom I'm speaking. If it were a seminar, we would have maybe. But to some extent, it's just a big seminar, right? This is what I'm hoping. I was charging architecture with something that I can see from your perspective would be seen, God, we're falling back into the representational. That's one point. Whereas I was really trying to say, make legible. What are you making legible? Now, you as architects are not. That is not your problematic. Your problematic is constructing the representation. I, as a non-architect, take you and want to see what is it that is being made legible, either about yourselves, as a community of practice. You're, of course, many communities, or in terms of what this architect has captured about something out there. Now, then you mentioned something else, which is the technology itself is, of course, a shaping fact, absolutely. But the problem is in the United States, again, and spoken as a social scientist, you as architects, you are inevitably in a situation where this technology is conditioned by whatever the purpose to which you put it. But believe me, if you are a theorist working on the implications of these technologies, you don't have the discipline of a practice like you have, right? And I'm sure when you are just absolutely in pure virtual studio, you also can get carried away, right? But the counter-disciplining that different conditions, the different frictions that you have to deal with, that is very important. And that is very often lacking, I find, in a lot of the writings about these new computer-based technologies, which just do exactly what I said at the beginning. They just take the technical capacities of these technologies and then project these scenarios. And again, I repeat, I'm sure when you're doing virtual studio, you can also get carried away with it. But when you're actually trying to do something that is out there, you are being disciplined, whether you know it or not, by certain. But these technologies do produce their own specific outcomes, and these spatialities that I was talking about, what needs to be negotiated is part of that. I mean, they are very powerful technologies. I really think that they have a shaping influence. And there are also, by the way, I'm just mentioning it as a footnote, and we're going to talk about it, finer points about software. That I just in passing mentioned, that software is not just, again, a purely technical issue. It is one way in which you develop or overdevelop some of the uses that the hardware can give you. And this is also, I mean, I don't know, I haven't thought about how this intersects with architectural practice. But, I mean, I know Greg Lynn, who used to be my colleague at Columbia University, and we did a lot of things together in the Annie events when he brought in the animated, you know what I'm talking about. The buildings inevitably look in a certain way. It's interesting that, and now there it's very transparent. There might be other softwares that you are all using, here at Columbia University, who knows, wherever. And you're also winding up with certain kinds of shapes, whether you know it or not, or certain, shape is too elementary a term, but you know what I mean, that you are partly conditioned also by the software you're using. And I don't know if any of you is experimenting with very different types of software to explode the boundaries of something, et cetera, and I think this is it, no? Thank you very much.
We are wonderfully conditioned.
And then we go.
And then we go straight.
This is not.